So my topic is changes made to the Endangered Species Act. Why is the Endangered Species Act important? So a lot of people may have some knowledge of the general history of the Endangered Species Act, but are unaware of recent developments that affect the enforcement of the Act. The Endangered Species Act is the strongest legal framework the United States has to protect species that are at risk of extinction. Without steady, biologically determined, consistent enforcement of the Act, species at risk have no protection against threats such as pollution, invasive species, overexploitation, and habitat destruction. Once a species is extinct, it's gone forever. No amount of investment can be made in the future that can bring the extinct species back. The investment in endangered species need to be made now in order to avert permanent consequences in the future. So ethics and research related to the Endangered Species Act. Why should we care about the research related to the Endangered Species Act? Conservationists rely on information about the response of populations of endangered species to threats such as pollution, invasive species, overexploitation, and habitat destruction in order to advocate for the listing of species threatened with extinction. Conservationists also need to know if a policy intended to save an endangered species is actually working. Without research, it's very difficult to understand what's transpiring in a way that will allow both scientists and activists to speak on behalf of endangered species in a way that will lead to meaningful change. So ethics and society related to the Endangered Species Act. Biocentric and egocentric ethics are at issue in the context of the Endangered Species Act. Often human beings are not under direct threat when an animal goes extinct, but that particular species is gone forever. If this occurs, the species that depend on it in the ecosystem are also permanently affected. When a species comes under threat of extinction, there is a responsibility to act in a way that will have a chance to save the species for future generations. If we don't act in a meaningful way, that responsibility has been abrogated. So the history of the Endangered Species Act. In 1962, Silent Spring alerted the public to the threat of pesticides to both animal and human health. This is widely credited with starting the environmental movement in the United States. In 1966, the Endangered Species Preservation Act was signed, establishing an initial list of endangered species. This was the first attempt to make it a category for species under threat of extinction. It provided the funding for the Fish and Wildlife Service to acquire habitat for these species. In 1969, there was another development, which is that the United States experienced what was to date the largest oil spill ever in Santa Barbara due to an offshore oil rig leak. This alerted the public to the presence of environmental degradation in the United States and underscored the need to take meaningful action. In 1969, the Endangered Species Preservation Act of 1969 was signed. This widened the scope of the Endangered Species Act of Preservation the Endangered Species Preservation Act of 1966 and established fines for poaching endangered species. Now, in the January of 1969, Richard Nixon took office. While he's commonly known for the Watergate scandal, he would play a key role in the environmental movement after popular support for environmentalism mounted. Due to public outrage at the presence of pesticides in our air and water, and due to the oil spill in Santa Barbara in 1969, the Council on Environmental Quality was created in the same year. This executive office coordinated environmental efforts. At his State of the Union address in 1970, Nixon proposed a sweeping air and water initiative to address these environmental concerns. Nixon played a key role in the environmental movement. In 1970, Nixon created the Environmental Protection Agency. The first Earth Day was celebrated in 1970. To follow up from these successes, the Clean Air Act was signed on December 31, 1970, and the Clean Water Act was signed on October 18, 1972. These successes were all made possible because Richard Nixon saw that environmentalism was popular in the United States and acted to satisfy the public's demands. Nixon first mentioned expanding protections against endangered species in an address to Congress in 1972. He talked about permitting protective measures to be undertaken before a species is so depleted that regeneration is difficult or impossible. Congress obliged Nixon and passed the Endangered Species Act, which was signed into law on December 28, 1973. The Endangered Species Act of 1973 dramatically increased the number of endangered species listed from the Endangered Species Preservation Acts of 1966 and 1969. It was designed to protect not only animals, but the ecosystems and habitats necessary for their survival. Throughout the time since the Act was passed, the Endangered Species Act had an umbrella effect of protecting many more species than just the listed species when reforms were implemented. The Endangered Species Act of 1973 has become one of the most significant wildlife conservation laws in the United States. Many species have been protected by the Act. As of 2023, 99% of listed species have been saved from extinction. There are some notable successes of saving species related to protections by the Endangered Species Act. One of these is the bald eagle. Before the passage of the Endangered Species Act, there were only 417 breeding pairs of bald eagles living in the lower 48 states. By 2006, there were more than 9,700. Another success story is the wolf. Before the passage of the Endangered Species Act, there were only a few hundred wolves. There are more than 5,000 today. A final example we'll talk about today is the peregrine falcon. Starting in the 1940s, the numbers of the peregrine falcon started to drop because of the introduction of synthetic pesticides to the environment. By 1975, there are only 324 nesting pairs left. After its listing as an endangered species, conservation efforts, including captive breeding programs, successful reintroduction, and habitat protection were implemented. By the time of their delisting from the Endangered Species Act in 1999, the peregrine falcon's numbers had increased to 1,650 nesting pairs. Despite these successes, there have been a number of problems with the Endangered Species Act since its passage in 1973. At present, there are 1,672 species listed as either endangered or threatened in the U.S. under the Endangered Species Act. This is not every species that biologically merits listing under the Act. A 2019 report finds that 500 species identified by the Fish and Wildlife Service as meriting listing under the Endangered Species Act have not been listed. This suggests that there are significant delays in the listing process as it's been operating. Indeed, a 2020 study found that the average species needs to wait 12 years to be listed under the Endangered Species Act instead of the mandated 2 years. The amount of species that have ever been delisted from the Endangered Species Act is very small. To date, only 54 species have ever been delisted from the Endangered Species Act due to recovery. There are 1,672 species listed. This is a small fraction. At present, there are many more species being added to the list than are delisted due to recovery. The following species are likely extinct but still listed as endangered under the Endangered Species Act. Additionally, it's estimated that roughly 50% of species that biologically merit listing are not listed due to resource constraints, political pressures, or prioritization of higher profile species. The monarch butterfly is just one example of this. Additionally, the Act is not equipped to deal with global environmental issues that can threaten species, such as climate change. So these are problems with the Endangered Species Act that have been around since its passage in 1973. The main thing I want to talk about today are the current developments associated with the Endangered Species Act. Many problems have emerged since Donald Trump took office in 2017. After he took office, Trump removed the blanket rule, which automatically extended endangered species protections to species newly classified as threatened. Under the new rules, a species newly classified as threatened did not have Endangered Species Act protections. Additionally, the Fish and Wildlife Service was required to write specific rules for each newly listed threatened species. This increased the administrative workload and delayed protections for threatened species. Another change that Trump made to the Endangered Species Act was that economic considerations were published alongside listing decisions, despite the Endangered Species Act's mandate that listing decisions be based solely on available science. This introduced the concern that economic pressures from industry could sway listing processes. Another change made to the Endangered Species Act was that rules were revised to limit critical habitat designations. Areas where a species was present before it was listed were prioritized for designation as critical habitat areas, limiting the range which a species could recover to after its listing. Additionally, unoccupied areas could only be designated as critical habitat if they contained essential physical or biological features deemed necessary for species conservation. This increased the burden of proof necessary for a habitat to be designated as critical habitat for a listed endangered species. Economic considerations were also weighed in designated critical habitat, serving to exclude certain areas from protection. Additionally, some terminology bearing on protection from future threats was changed, including the term foreseeable future. The definition of this term was narrowed. A final change made by the Trump administration was the modification of rules under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act to undermine protections for incidental take. Incidental take is the unintentional harm of bird species. This rules change served to detriment efforts to hold industry accountable for the incidental take of bird species listed as endangered. After he took office, Biden reinstated many of the old rules present for the Endangered Species Act before Trump first took office. However, these restorations proved to be temporary. Biden reinstated the blanket rule that extends protections for species newly classified as threatened. He replaced the rule preventing economic considerations from being made in the listing of endangered species. Lastly, he reversed the Trump rules that restricted critical habitat designations to areas currently occupied by endangered species, instead allowing habitat restoration to a large range formerly held by the species. However, some rules set by the Trump administration remain, such as a requirement that there be a reasonable certainty a species would suffer without listing. Additionally, rules allowing projects that harm habitat of endangered species piecemeal were retained. Notably, rules were not strengthened beyond the 2019 levels, leaving much more work to be done to adequately protect all species that biologically warrant listing under the Act. Biden's restorations were severely undermined by the victory of Donald Trump in 2024. In Trump's second term, all of Biden's restorations to the Endangered Species Act are expected to be undone. These include the blanket rule extending endangered species protections to threatened species, economic considerations for listing endangered species, and limits to critical habitat designations. Additionally, there are new changes to the Act that Trump is promising. On April 16, 2025, the Fish and Wildlife Service and National Marine Fisheries Service proposed redefining the word harm to exclude habitat modification or destruction. At the present time, habitat destruction is one of the primary factors for declining population numbers of endangered species, and the current administration wants to exclude this from its assessment of whether a species has been harmed. This would allow activities like logging, mining, or development in critical habitats as long as they don't directly target species. Significant reforms are needed to address the developing situation of biodiversity loss in the 21st century. In the context of the Endangered Species Act, not only are we not making progress in addressing long-term problems like listing every species that biologically merits listing, once we thought we had to protect the species that are listed are not assured. This is a developing situation that merits our attention if meaningful action is to be taken to restore and expand the protections of the Endangered Species Act in the future. If you're interested in how the Endangered Species Act is being undermined, this is definitely a topic to follow in the news. Here are my citations.